He's, I think, a true entrepreneur, because a true entrepreneur, as you probably know, it's not just about business. It's about being creative, I think, and creatively expressing yourself and your gifts and your talents in a way that blesses other people. And of course, in the business world, that ends up being financially rewarding usually. And but entrepreneurship, I think, makes great pastors. It makes great teachers. It expresses itself in many ways. And so I've seen Jack be incredibly creative his whole life. He's just got that gene, and for some reason, he's more keen on making that happen in the business world, supplying a good or a service, than I ever was. I had a very specific purpose in mind from my industry experience to satisfy a need that would have benefited me. He thinks outside the box on a different level to me. So he's going to tell you about his experiences over the last several years with different types of businesses and what they've taught him. So, Jack.
Great. So I run an aquaponic farm. So for those of you who don't know, what aquaponics is it's a form of hydroponics. And what hydroponics is essentially it's a way of growing plants, except rather than growing them in soil and fertilizing them and getting them nutrients that way, you grow them in water. And you put chemicals into the water. That's how you grow the plants, essentially. And essentially what I do a very similar system. The big difference with mine, though, is it's also connected to a fish tank. And so what will happen is we have these fish, and they swim around, and they do their business, and they produce nutrients in the water. And then that's pumped out into a bacteria colony. Bacteria convert all of the various chemicals in the water into the various nitrates and other fertilizers that the plants need to get their nutrients and survive. And so then that's pumped through a series of porous systems where all of our plants are rooted, and they get all of their nutrients that way. And so they get a very high amount of nutrients, and they can grow very quickly, sometimes as much as 4 or 5 times as quickly as they would in soil, because they're getting huge amounts of nutrients, huge amounts of water, and then it all gets cycled back into the fish tank, and the roots of the plants filter out all of the harmful substances from the water and keep the fish alive. So it's this little controlled ecosystem. It's all in a closed system, and so fish get clean water, the plants get nutrients, and I get profits. So it's a nice little system there. So that's essentially what I do. Primarily, we grow herbs, basil. There's a couple pictures there of some of our products. But I guess to tell you how I really got into this, I'll probably have to go a fair way back to the beginning. When I was a kid, my dad, as he mentioned a little bit, he was a businessman. He was a bit of an entrepreneur. And when I was very young, before I was born, he had a company called, was it Upfront at that point was the name of the company? Superimpose. Sorry, it was later changed to Upfront. Yeah, sorry. He had a program called Superimpose that it was a printing software that would allow you to basically, it was software that involved with the layouts when you do printing in large-scale print jobs, essentially. And so he sold that to a Seattle-based company, Scenic Soft, and when I was about 3 years old, my whole family moved to the United States, right? And then a few years later, he left Scenic Soft, went back to Australia, and started a second company, which is very similar software. This time it was called Metrics. And this one, for the majority of my conscious life, was him running this company. Lithotechnics was the name of the company. The product was Metrics. And all when I was going through elementary school, high school, that's what he did. And then eventually that led us back to the United States. When I would have been in about middle school, I came to the United States, and then a few years after that, he sold the company. So I guess the point here is I've been around entrepreneurship all my life. I've sitting here watching my dad, and he before I was born, he wasn't always an entrepreneur, but as long as I knew him, he was. And so I guess that's always been embroiled into me since I was very young. And so I went into high school here in the United States, and my plan for the longest time was to go to college and study computer science to try and become a software developer. But during my senior year of high school, I decided I changed my mind. I kind of did a full 180 and I decided, you know what, I don't really want to go to college for computer science. I decided I wanted to do my own thing in computer science. And so what I decided was I was going to start a video game company, right? And so it's that Shapes Entertainment was the name of the company. It's the one on the left. So that's for the second half of my senior year, and then the year out of high school, first year out of high school. That's what I worked on, and I'd like to say it was very successful, but it wasn't. It was, in many ways, really a failure. Which, I mean, for your first company isn't particularly surprising, unfortunately. But I guess the biggest thing there is I learned a lot. You know, I really got into it because I liked software and I liked video games at the time, and that was why I wanted to start a company in that. But then when I came out of it, I realized, you know, I really actually enjoyed just the idea of running a business and doing my own thing. And so I thought, well, video games may not be the industry for me, but I would still like to be an entrepreneur. And so I went and I looked around for other business opportunities. And so what I found was my second company, which was Doceo, the logo's up there, that was a tutoring company. Now, I did a lot of things differently on my second company that I didn't do on my first company. First thing that I did differently was I didn't choose the idea based on what I enjoyed doing for fun. I chose the video game company because I enjoyed video games and I enjoyed programming. Whereas Doceo, tutoring is, I can't say it's one of my passions, but it's something that at the time I actually worked as a tutor at Edmonds Community College, and that was how I funded most of that company as well, was from my profits from that. And I had seen a need. I saw a lot of, there was a lot of an opportunity for tutoring to be done over the internet rather than in person to, save money, right, where it wasn't very popular in the area at the time. And so that's what I decided to go into business with. The other thing that I did very differently in the second business was I got a business partner. The game company I'd done completely on my own, which made, especially when I wasn't very experienced, made it a lot more difficult. More difficult to fund it as well when I'm only paying for it myself, but also just, it's nice when you have the affirmation of a second person. You catch your mistakes, you can delegate different jobs to different things. And so for my second company, I brought on a business partner who at the time was a real estate agent. So we've worked together actually ever since. So that was my second company, and that did relatively well. But then about a year after I started it, we were going into the summer. And in the summer months, tutoring dropped significantly because most of our clients were high school students, had a couple low-level college students, but high school was our primary thing. And so over the summer, we had about 3 months, and we'd be planning for this because we knew it was going to drop. And so we sat down and we looked at our books and our numbers, and we decided, well, what should we do for this next year? How should we expand? And in the end, what we decided was it made more sense to cash in and start something new. Partly because there were some changes in the industry at the time, a couple of new competitors that just had a lot more funding than we did. I was funding it myself, whereas a lot of these guys had millions of dollars of venture capital, which really, it made a huge difference. And so what we decided was, rather than continuing with tutoring, we would cash in what we had and we'd figure out how we can invest that to make a new business that's more profitable and more effective with the new skills that we've learned. And that's when I came up with WA Aquaponics. That's what I'm still doing that now. And so that's how I got into that. The way I found that company, I was looking for a while to try and find companies that would be effective and that would return a profit. And part of it, there were two main reasons why I chose aquaponics. Partly because at the time, and still now, there's a pretty big surge in the need for healthy food in the area. Everybody likes to buy local organic produce, and small farms are very, very popular right now. So that was a big part of it. The other part of it was I had a friend who was quite experienced with this aquaponic style of growing food that was still pretty new. The style itself has been around for a very long time, but it hasn't really been done effectively commercially much at all. There's only 1 or 2 farms in California before us that have done this to a great deal of success. And so that's how I got into that. I also had one other company, it's the third logo there, which was a small real estate software company. What we did is we had a CRM and some web development and a bit of lead generation, and it was kind of like an all-in-one package for real estate agents. And that one, I did that a little bit along the way. I've done a couple other little side things here and there, but that's essentially where I came from with all of that. And here's a, oh, so this is from my tutoring company. This is just a screenshot of one of the pieces of software that we developed. It was essentially an interactive online whiteboard and video call system that you could use to tutor people over the internet. And so essentially, so that's essentially how I got into entrepreneurship. So, bit onto my talk, millennial entrepreneurship. So essentially, I guess a good place to start is to talk about some of the raw numbers associated with millennials getting into entrepreneurship today. If you look historically, back in the 90s, roughly 35-ish% of businesses were started by people in their 20s and early 30s. Whereas now, if you look at the numbers, it's roughly 18%, 17 or 18, depending on what you look at. And so it's clear, there's been quite a decrease in the number of business startups from young people by percentage. And nobody knows exactly why this is. There are a lot of potential reasons for this, but this is one of the questions that I'd like to try and answer. So to start off, I guess one of the more important things is to why does it matter that most businesses are started by older people than younger people? Why is that important? And I think part of the reason is for those people who aren't millennials, right? For those people who are in the older generations, what millennials does still matters for a couple of reasons. The old cliche that they are the future. The children are the ones that are going to be running things in a few years, and I think that's part of it. In 20 years from now, most of the businesses will be run by millennials. But I think that more importantly is what happens to the businesses that are currently around. If what's going to happen to them after they go. Now, either over time they're going to eventually fade and disappear, go out of business, or they're going to continue to grow and eventually fall under the hands of people who are currently millennials. And I think one of the biggest thing is understanding the legacy of any company currently, any company or associated with or run or whatever. In the future, either it's going to have to fall into the hands of some form of millennials, or probably end up getting put out of business by some form of millennial at some point in time. If you go further enough in the future, there's really no way to avoid it. And so if millennials are going to, in the future, end up being some of your major competitors, then understanding why millennials think the way they do and how millennials think is going to be very important to you as a business to understand how you should prepare for the future. And so I think there are a couple things for millennials that I'm going to talk about that really set them apart from other generations. And I think you can really divide it into two categories. First of all, it's their aptitudes, what they're good at. And then the second thing is what their values are. What are they striving for? And so I think the first thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is their values. And I think in part of the explanation, this has something to do with why a lot of the time millennials tend to start less businesses. I think one of the major factors here is they value safety. Younger generations tend these days to avoid taking large-scale risks. And I think part of that is often they have more risks actually already on the playing field as it is, partly because some of the things like student loans have gone up very significantly in the last few decades, and they're constantly going up. And so when someone is out of college these days, they may have tens of thousands of dollars of debt already for their student loans. And how do you go ahead and start a business when you're already in tens of thousands of dollars debt? You don't have the luxury of taking those sorts of risks because you've already taken a risk. And so I think part of the reason why millennials are less willing to take risks is we already have to take risks just to get through college in a lot of cases. And so I think that's part of it. And I think some of the other things are their aptitudes. I think we're growing in a very changing world, and these days one of the biggest things that millennials get into is the tech field, particularly software, a lot of the time online software. And one of the very, very big ones that millennials tend to get into is online service-based software. So things like social media marketing or web development or even digital consulting, these sorts of things are very, very popular among millennials. And I mean, it makes sense because these things have a very low barrier to entry. When you start a business in something like web development, all you really need to know is how to get clients and how to do web development. You don't have to actually develop a product the majority of the time. Often if you are coming out of college, often you'll already know quite a lot about web development, or you can take online courses. There are a lot of ways to learn those sorts of skills. And a lot of the time, these are skills that to the older generations aren't that important. They're very easy to outsource. If I want to develop a website for my business and I've got to already have a thriving business, getting a website built by somebody else is something I really don't have to worry at all about. It's quite fast to go to a web development firm and say, hey, I want a website. Here's how much I'm willing to pay. And so
Just call Justin.
yeah, yeah, Justin can tell you. Yeah, so I think that's one of the reasons why these sorts of tech jobs are very, very lucrative to younger generations. Very easy to get into. And I think the other part of that, though, is I think we do see, as a result, we see a lot of millennials going into digital services, but we don't see as many millennials going into some of the more traditional jobs. Things like plumbing or being an electrician or welding, these sorts of things, we're actually starting to see a huge shortage of them. And it's actually starting to become quite a problem. Prices of all of these things are going through the roof in many places. And I think that's only going to continue. Part of that is also when you go to college these days, you have 4 to 5 or sometimes more years that you're spending doing education, and usually you've made your mind up within the first couple of years of that what you want to do, because you have to specialize. And part of the problem with that is that means that when it comes to supply and demand, there's a bit of a delay. If I see that there's a demand now, whether that demand's going to remain in 3 to 5 years when I'm out of college is a whole other question entirely. And so, we see a lot of people that are going into software right now because they started college 5 or 6 years ago. And at the time they went to college, software was very, very huge. Web development was very lucrative, and it still is. But the question of is it going to remain that lucrative in the future? It's very hard to say. No one can say exactly what the economy is going to be like in 5 or 6 years. And I think that's part of why we see this shortage in tradesmen. While many people would very much like to start a plumbing business or something if they knew it was going to make them a lot of money, how can they be sure that by the time they've done all of their schooling that that's still going to be a possibility when some of these other jobs promise a lot more safety, things like digital services? But I think that does, in many ways, provide an opportunity for millennials. I think there are a lot of opportunities out there for more traditional jobs done with a more millennial spin. Farming is a great example. That's part of the reason I got into farming. There are very few young people in farming right now. The majority of farms are quite old, run by people who have been doing it for the majority of their life already. And there are very few startup farms or small farms. And I think that's part of, in farming, we are getting a push towards urban farming, which is more, growing food in the city, very close to where it's going to be eaten, and then delivering it over a shorter distance. Because it has a lot of benefits. In many ways, it's cheaper, especially now with some of these aquaponic systems that can grow food more efficiently. You can take something the size of a small parking lot, and you can grow enough food to feed the whole local neighborhood just in that space. And so some of these sorts of systems are getting more popular. But I think they're still relatively rare comparatively with the traditional methods. And I think these sorts of opportunities for millennials are really big. And I think a lot of millennials miss these because they love to see the low barrier to entry that technology and web development affords them. They see that and they say, oh, I can do that, or I learned that in college, or whatever. But I think what we're starting to see is we're seeing a lot of these to the point where it's getting quickly to the point where it's an incredibly competitive market, and it's not so far to say that in the future it may very well be too oversaturated. Becoming a web developer today is incredibly competitive, and if you don't have a college degree, chances are you're not going to do particularly well yourself unless you're very good at getting clients. However, some of these other industries like farming, plumbing, there's huge demand with nobody going to fill it. And so I think if I could have any one takeaway from what I've said here today, the biggest thing is that millennials should be encouraged that there is entrepreneurial opportunities and innovations to be made outside of the realms of technology and software and all of these things that millennials grew up with. But all of the traditional jobs and the traditional industries have huge innovation opportunities, and you don't need to be a techie or a software developer to have a thriving business as a millennial. So we sell them in a couple places. Primarily right now we sell them to local delivery companies. So like those like home delivery boxes that you get weekly or monthly that'll deliver them to you. We sell mostly to those sorts of companies at this point. Yeah. I think part of it is a lot of millennials are very encouraged to seek jobs that they like, the follow your heart kind of idea. And I think that's in many cases, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. But sometimes that you'll only not work a day in your life because no one will hire you. You in a lot of cases, we need to encourage them. Don't just look at what do I want to do, but also look at where is the money. And I think as these things become rarer, the prices tend to go up, the money tends to become, more lucrative, and I think that, will draw people if we encourage them to think, economically. Think what is actually the most economic decision, not just what will I enjoy the most. I think that's a big part of it. Yes, everybody wants to be, the top dog. Everybody wants the highest paying job. But really, there's not a whole lot of jobs that are the highest paying job. I mean, that's why it is the highest paying job, And I think people need to understand that. But I think a lot of millennials really aren't taught that, And I mean, there are a lot of people that have a lot of different opinions on this. There are a lot of people that would attribute it to the whole, everyone gets a trophy idea, that you see on Facebook so often, But and that may be part of it, But I guess I'm certainly not qualified to tell you exactly why any of this is happening the way it is, But I mean, I think it is clear that there are things that need to be done. Well, I think the biggest thing is to start out. I didn't really think that much like an entrepreneur. I mean, my game company did very badly for that very reason. And I think if I was afraid to fail in that company, I probably never would have learned to think like an entrepreneur. I think a lot of that is, trying. And I think thinking like an entrepreneur, anyone can do it, but most people won't do it because it takes a level of risk. And I think a lot of people are very afraid of risk these days. I think there is an illusion that going to college and doing the usual path is somehow less risky, which I think the problem is when you start a business, you're essentially betting everything on the fact that you have some sort of understanding of the laws of supply and demand, and that supply and demand will remain to be a thing in the future, and some of these immutable laws of economics will last for a long time, whereas the state of the software development job market in the future is much more volatile. And so I think in many ways entrepreneurship can be less risky than going to college. But I think for the majority of people, it sounds less risky, partly because more people are doing it. And when everyone else is doing something, it feels like, oh, well, everyone else is doing it, so we can't all be wrong, but you can all be out of work. And, that can be a real problem. Yeah. Okay, so my first customer, well, I guess let's go with aquaponics for this. So my first customer for aquaponics, how I got him was actually, I built a robot that would go through LinkedIn, and it would find LinkedIn connections in my industry that I had a high number of common connections with. And so I just let this thing run in the background, and eventually it found somebody who ran a produce distribution service, and he was pulled up, and I got a notification that I'd connected with him, and so I just shot him a message. And he was interested because he'd recently bought the company from the previous owner, and so he was looking for new ways to make it kind of his own and really develop it and change some things. And so what he started to do was he was looking to a lot of small local companies like myself and looking for ways to make himself different from the competition. And so I met him at a Starbucks. We sat down, and that was the first time we ever met, and just basically talked numbers, talked about the industry over coffee, and then things kind of went from there. And then a few months later, he bought his first set of product from me. Yeah, so currently with the farm, the majority of primarily we're just reinvesting most of what we get. We're looking to just expand the amount of production because currently we can definitely, on the land that we have a lot more land that we haven't put these systems on. It's a pretty dense system, and so in the land we have about 100,000 square feet of land, and we're only using a very small percentage of that because the way we grow our systems, it's quite expensive, and it's all confined in shipping containers and insulated, and so we control all the heat, and we control what light frequencies all the plants get, so that we can control whether we want them to flower or whether we want them to grow leaves, because the light frequencies affect that and things. And so some of that causes it can be rather time consuming to expand. So I guess most of what we're doing is we're just focusing on getting more containers with more plants and trying to basically break into more markets. Currently what we're trying to do is get into more restaurants. We want to get a lot, because they tend to buy larger orders, and they're a pretty consistent order as well, and so trying to get into some of those is essentially what we're focusing on right now. Yeah, so I guess there is potentially possibilities there. I guess at this point we're probably not big enough to really consider franchising, and that would take a fair bit of our resources to get all of that set up. And so I think one of the biggest things is, we're not really at capacity for our current facility. Once we reach maximum capacity for our space, we're going to be looking at moving to other spaces. One of the things we'd really love to do, which we can't do yet, is try and find a place more in the inner city of Seattle, because that's where a lot of our deliveries are. And currently we are pairing with a lot of these delivery box services and things that are pretty local, but for them local is 25-30 miles. I believe the USDA sets the definition for local actually as within 100 miles, which really isn't that local. So what we'd really love to be able to do is get closer to the city, and so we can say local within 5 miles, or even within 2 miles, depending on where we are. And so some of that kind of thing can be really helpful. And so depending on how that goes, we may consider franchising into places like that in the future once we reach a higher capacity. I'd love to see a drone harvest the plants. That would be very interesting, but I think we're a long way off. Yeah. That's actually a great way, and there are a couple companies that do similar things with hydroponics. Most of them don't use the fish. That's a relatively niche idea. But there are a number I believe there's one in Chicago that has started by Elon Musk's brother, actually started this company. And so what he does is he actually is just in a parking lot. He bought out a small parking lot in the inner city of Chicago and just he's got 5 shipping containers on that he grows plants in. Now his are mainly tomatoes and cucumbers and that sort of thing. But it's a similar idea, and it could definitely be done in that kind of environment here too. I think one of the bigger things is a lot of those ones that do it on a parking lot and things do it outdoors. It's like in a greenhouse or something, which we originally started in a greenhouse when we started. But one of the problems is you don't get as much control over the light or the heat, which are 2 huge factors, because the heat and the light are both the number 1 factors, I guess number 1 and number 2 factors that decide whether the plant flowers or not. With basil specifically, what you want to do is you want to keep it going for as long as possible before it flowers, because its leaves will grow back, right? And it can live for years, but usually after 3 to 4 months, it will start to flower, and then you have to take it out and put it and plant a new one. And so that on a rooftop, that 3 to 4 months may be 2 months, and so that is a lot less effective. But we have done it, and it's definitely possible. Well, I've seen a lot of aquaponics systems use tilapia, because you can eat them and you can sell them, and then that's a separate income stream. Part of the problem is they're actually very heavily regulated by the EPA. Currently, we are actually using goldfish, partly because they're incredibly cheap. They actually do produce a lot of nutrients, and they're anywhere from yeah, anyone who's had a goldfish knows that. Anywhere from 10 to 30 cents a fish, whereas a tilapia maybe $3 a fish when they're small. And so part of it is, they're just cheap, and they're not really very well regulated at all. So, you can have hundreds of fish in the same tank producing a lot of nutrients and not have to worry about anything legal. Well, you can't sell them. You don't have to worry about the EPA showing up, killing all your fish, and then giving you a $100,000 fine. So that's the main reason why we don't use tilapia. I did know of a farmer in Eastern Washington actually, who he did traditional farming, but he had one little place where he was trying out some aquaponics with tilapia, and that's actually exactly what the EPA did. They came in, they fined him $100,000 and killed all of his fish, which he had 50 grand worth of fish in there as well. So it was pretty brutal. That's why we're avoiding tilapia and those sorts of fish at this point. Partly because we'll probably try it in the future, but I would rather like have more money to spend on the legal side of it, just to make absolutely sure that I'm doing everything by the book, because a lot of this stuff is pretty confusing and quite difficult, and the lawyers for this sort of like very niche stuff can be very expensive, and so currently we're playing it safe. Currently it's actually still pretty small, so it's only 2 people. So my business partner and I, we do most of the harvesting ourselves. And having everybody in the company having equity makes a big difference. So it's really like, as far as incentivizations and things like that, it's not really a fair comparison. So I mean, we're looking into potentially getting people to help harvest and things, but at this point we both spend a lot of, like, for me it's my full-time job, my partner it's his full-time job as well. He also does some real estate things as well, but this is his primary thing, and so. So we get most of it. Get most of it done ourselves. The delivery and the harvesting, the actual system itself doesn't take a whole lot of time to run. Partly because it's the plants cycle, the water cycles pretty in a self-contained system. So much traditional farming does have a fair bit. You've got to do pesticides and you've got to do fertilizing and you've got to do crop rotations and things. But it pretty much all handles itself. The nutrients are in the water. They cycle. And essentially we have to put in some supplementary nutrients every now and then if you see that a bit of the chemistry is slightly off, like there's not enough potassium or there's not enough nitrogen or whatever, but for the most part it runs itself. So what we primarily do is just harvesting and delivery, which at this point we don't have enough volume for it to really require anyone else.
Does marketing become an issue, or is there more demand than supply?
There's enough demand that it's not particularly difficult. I mean, we're still looking for more sales channels because we're growing a little more than we're selling at this point, and we'd like to deck out that, but at the same time we don't want to go too fast because we don't want to oversell. Because the plants, when you do have, let's say you have a bad month for whatever reason. A few months ago, when we were still in the greenhouse, we had snow in January, and we did not expect it. And it did cause some damage, and some of our plants slowed down their growth because of it. Not too badly, but things like that do affect it. So if you're decked out to the maximum with volume, then you have logistical problems. So we've got a bit of selling. My business partner handles more of the sales, and I handle more of the logistics. That's how we tend to balance it out. So as far as like just breaking even on one good customer actually breaks even. For on a monthly basis, but then breaking even on my investment is another story. But yeah, so one customer breaks even for the monthly. I mean, it really depends on the volume, because we sell some customers will sell, like they'll want the little individual packets of basil, like the delivery companies. They love the little like $2 packets. Right, and they'll maybe get a couple hundred of those, and then that's what they'll get each week or something like that. And then restaurants want like a pound bag or a couple pound bags, and so, which also they have very different pricing if they're packaged in a pound versus if they're packaged in a small set 0.75 ounce clamshell. Yeah, I think that there are a couple problems with that. One of the best things about aquaponics is it makes use of things that are very abundant in America. Things like shipping containers. I can get a retired shipping container that, let's say, it's slightly damaged, so it can't bear the 100-ton load that it needs to be rated for actual shipping, right? And so now it's this retired shipping container, perfectly fine for anything where it's just sitting there, like growing this. Whereas in other parts of the world, actually getting that shipping container to them is incredibly expensive, and it may make more sense just to grow it in the ground. And same with we use a lot of our piping is done with PVC, which PVC is incredibly cheap here. You can get one of the long 12-foot rods for like 30 cents, whereas getting PVC in a lot of those parts of the world is going to be expensive. So getting the tubing, and I think a lot of it you have to be pretty precise with it, because if you do skimp on what tubing you use, if you end up with leaks. Right, if the way that you control, if the water flows are not perfect, because I think a lot of it we also use these little dripper things that make sure it's always dripping at exactly 4 gallons an hour per 12 plants. Per 8 plants. And so those little things, they're very expensive here. Those sort of little manufactured plugs, but I feel like those would be more expensive in other parts of the world. So In a society like America, it makes sense. Probably not so much over there. Now, you could probably design a full system and then ship it over as a whole part rather than assembling it there, and you may be able to do that as a thing, but I think it may just make more sense to sow seeds. I mean, depending on their climate, they may or may not be able to do that. Yeah, the water isn't particularly clean. Like you would never drink the water in one of these systems. Especially, it's probably more dirty in many ways than like a lake, because normally the nutrients that you would get in soil or a natural lake would be probably a fraction of the amount you'd get in what we do, because it's very high density. We basically push the nutrient density to the limit before it starts to kill the fish. And so the fish are fine, and then there's kind of a tipping point, and then it is a problem. And so we keep just a little way below that. So it's not the safest water. But fish aren't picky as far as what water you use. You don't have to use clean water. The fish won't care. In a foreign area, most of those probably wouldn't be an issue. I think part of it is tilapia is the big one, just because it produces a lot of waste. Something like salmon or something like that, they're a lot harder to keep, but also they just don't produce the same amount of nutrients. So that's why tilapia is good. Tilapia specifically is very regulated here. Partly because and I'm not 100% sure exactly how all of it works, but there's a lot of stuff relating to just imports with China. There's because it's not a native fish. But China produces a very, very large amount of tilapia, and they produce it in a very confined space. And we have had some problems here of people releasing tilapia into the wild and it causing environmental issues. But most of those are because we've got a lot of local salmon here, and they do directly compete with salmon. And so that's mostly why all of this is. So I would imagine in somewhere like India, it probably wouldn't be as much of a problem. Also because tilapia prefer a colder climate, which somewhere like India, I doubt they would thrive there anyway. So you could definitely you could try it. I don't know what the laws would be in those sorts of countries, but I imagine they'd be more lax than the EPA.
Thank you so much.